thought, this jacket's hot for me. I can't imagine wearing a trench coat. So he wasn't wearing it except for effect. And that effect was at school. Because as Mr. McGuire showed you, he fancied himself a school shooter. He admired school shooters. He wanted to be a school shooter. Now, whether or not this was a product of his mental illness, you'll have to decide. And again, that's for his attorney to argue. But those facts are pretty clear from his writings. Mr. McGuire showed you entry over entry where he talks about these things. So whether this was a product of his mental illness or not, this was clearly on his mind, and this is clearly what he had planned. Now, we have seen from Rose's parenting style, from these two large exhibits that I have in evidence up here with the emails from the mom, that she is very proactive. And her daughter called her a helicopter mom. I know that plaintiffs have complained about every parenting decision they've ever made since this child was 3 years old. But let's be real. Nobody searches their almost 18-year-old's room. In fact, that's a pretty gross violation of their privacy. That's not happening. Most people are not searching their 18-year-old's computers, although we did have one plaintiff that said she still searches her 20-year-old's computer. So I guess it varies from parent to parent, but in reality, when a person's becoming a young adult, they start to get a certain level of autonomy. And this is necessary, right? Because we're raising children to the point of 18. In our society, 18 is when you're ready to go off in the world on your own, ready to cut that umbilical cord completely and go be your own person. And there's steps as you get up to that, right? I mean, you're a baby, your parents carry you everywhere, you become a toddler, you walk on your own. You're in elementary school, your parents drive you to school, you get to junior high, you're allowed to walk, you get into high school, you get your own car. These are life events that occur, and as you grow up, you get more autonomy, you get more privacy as you become an adult. I think it's ridiculous to put the burden on these parents that they should have been searching this child's room. Searching a room for a young man who had never had any problems. He never had a detention in school. He didn't get in trouble for chewing gum. He'd never been suspended. He never failed a class. He'd never been violent. He'd never gotten in a fist fight. He'd never been arrested. He never got caught drinking, using drugs, smoking. What were the parents? Oh, wait, I know what it is. He played video games. He's in his room alone playing video games. Red flag, red flag. As a mother of 7 children, I'm telling you, they play video games. And as they get older, they like to spend more time playing video games. Now, whether or not this turned out in retrospect to be a small portion of a mental illness is easier to see in retrospect. At the time, it's not a terribly unusual behavior. No, I don't want to go out as much. I don't see how this is some big red flag. It's just not happening. Now, you did hear Mr. McGuire and some of the other plaintiffs talk about some of the documentation that Dr. Peterson spoke about. Now, you heard Dr. Peterson tell you himself, the word choices in my report were mine. So when he listened to everyone talk and he chose the word volatile, it's not because they said volatile, that's the word he chose. He also took individual events and put them into the report in such a way that it made it look like this might have been a persistent problem. And this is all part of the doctor's analysis. I'm not saying it's right or wrong way to do it, but you heard Rose and you heard Tony, to the extent you could understand the stories we were talking about, that some of these events in Dr. Peterson's report, although they did happen, were one-time events. For example, the 3-year-old temper tantrum, fear of heights issue. Rose actually had paperwork. She still has paperwork from when the kids were in preschool and Mother's Day out. And she showed him one where a teacher one time sent home a report that said, we were up on the slide today and Dimitri was afraid to go down because he was afraid of heights and he threw a tantrum. And somehow got written in such a way that it made it look like it was a more persistent behavior. Now, to Dr. Peterson, when he's looking at all the pieces, to him it might be. But what was reported from the family is that it was a one-time event. So as the person perceiving this, as the person living this in real time, as the person who's not going back after something horrible has happened and looking at what's happening in the here and now, that doesn't look like a red flag. Now, what would look like a red flag? When the school failed to monitor their computer systems and allowed Dimitri to conduct searches of a nature that should have set off immediate alarm bells. Ms. Goldsberry, if you would put up the searches such as Columbine evidence photos, 357 revolver, and Virginia Tech shooters. These should draw some attention by school officials. Now, plaintiffs may argue that we don't know for certain that these came off of the school records, but you can look at these exhibits. If you'll put up the exhibits, we had Clayton Horn on the stand, and he testified these look very much like the block warnings that he got from his school computer when searches were done that were inappropriate searches where you couldn't get around the firewall. And we have documents and evidence. You can take a look at some of these. You also heard Clayton Horn say that he had an individual login for his computer. I believe Ms. Giannis said she thinks her son did. I'm not 100% that's who said it. One of the plaintiffs did, as well as Rose, who still has the login for her son for the school computer. Now, what about Tony and Rose? Well, you've heard me say that they didn't fail in their legal duty. First of all, Dimitri was almost 18 years old. He was about 4.5 months away from being 18. At age 17, you can consent to sex. You can consent to your own psychological treatment. If you run away from home, the cops aren't going to bring you back home. And most importantly, at age 17, when you commit a crime, you're charged as an adult. And in this case, Dimitri was indeed charged with his crime as an adult. Now, unlike Dimitri and Lucky Gunner, Tony and Rose did not commit any crime. And despite a slightly dramatic moment where a plaintiff seemed to indicate that Tony and Rose might be charged with a crime in the future, that's 100% untrue, because Rose and Tony did not break any penal statute at all. In fact, Rose and Tony completely cooperated with the police after the shooting occurred. And as we discussed in voir dire, Tony and Rose had no obligation by statute to lock up their guns to keep them from Dimitri. He was old enough to bear that adult responsibility. Yet, Tony and Rose did have their guns locked up, all of them being safely stored either in the gun cabinet or the gun safe. Still, due to Dimitri's age, Rose and Tony had no obligation to hide the keys from Dimitri. But they did. They had the keys hidden in a safe place. And Mr. McGuire's 100% wrong. The keys were not in the kitchen. The keys were not kept in a common area. If you'll recall from our direct testimony, we put up the pictures. The keys were kept in the top of a cabinet that is 8 feet off the floor in the parents' private bedroom. Now, they could have left the guns on the table. They had no duty under criminal law to lock those guns up, because I guarantee you, if they had broken a criminal law, they would have been charged with it. But they didn't. And nevertheless, they were locked up, and nevertheless, the keys were hidden. But that's not enough, right? Because plaintiffs are now telling you that I guess they should have locked the keys up too. I guess they needed a separate lockbox to lock up the keys to keep them from a kid they had no duty to keep the keys from. Or maybe bury them in the backyard. I don't know. Mr. Torres pulled out a key in a dramatic moment for all of us, I thought was really fun, to kind of indicate he had his key in his own pocket. That's fine. I mean, it's a thing. You could do that. But that doesn't mean you have an obligation to do it. And it also doesn't mean that you have a reasonable ability to foresee the criminal acts of another human being. You don't know what you don't know. And I appreciated the homage that they put up to me in their closing argument. But I really think that Socrates got it right. You can't know what's going on in somebody else's head, because if we did, we wouldn't have any homicides. We wouldn't have any suicides. We wouldn't have any crime at all, because anyone who remembers the Minority Report movie, we could recognize it before it happened and we could stop it. But as humans, that's not how we function. We're not telepathic. We don't have those abilities. We do the best we can with the observable behavior that we have. And if he had been breaking the law, if he had been violent, if he had been using drugs, if he had been abusing animals or setting fires or holding a magnifying glass on ants, anything, then maybe you'd go, we need to look at that. He had slipping grades, but he never failed. He started to want to spend a little bit more time alone. These were the two main things that you saw. And he wasn't isolated or barricaded. We showed you pictures. Let's show you some more, Miss Goldsberry. If you'll put those pictures up. These are pictures in the months, just months right before the shooting took place. This is Dimitri the summer before in Greece. Does he look like he's got some social anxiety where he's barricading himself in the room? No, he traveled to a foreign country. He's visiting with relatives and friends. He's taking younger children around on a four-wheeler. Does this look like a child that you would think, dang, he's depressed, man, look at that? No, there were no signs of depression here, none whatsoever. Let's go to some of the other pictures, Miss Goldsberry. We see him with big smiles with his family members. We see him posing for pictures. This is very close to the time of the shooting. We see a kid with a hat and a big smile. We don't see a kid barricaded in a room who looks depressed. If someone showed you a picture of this kid without any other context, would you say, that kid really needs to get some mental health intervention? Because that's the kid that Rose and Tony saw every day until he had a psychotic break. And their lives and his lives, and God love them, all of the plaintiffs, and God bless every single one of them. Their lives were forever and changed irrevocably so. Now, if it had been foreseeable to these folks that there was a simmering mental illness, they would have done something about it. You heard Tony say that his son went on a diet and intentionally lost weight, about 20 pounds. And Tony was concerned. He's like, man, you shouldn't lose that much weight. And even though Rose had already taken them to his regular doctor, Tony's like, no, I'm a little worried about this. Took him to a separate doctor to get checked because he was worried about that. That was over some weight loss. If they had seen any mental illness, they certainly would have acted on it. Looking back now, can we say it was mental illness? I don't think you can based on the signs that they saw. But when the break happened, when the psychotic break happened, all hell broke loose, literally and figuratively. And you heard Dr. Self tell us about the signs and symptoms of schizoaffective disorder and schizophrenia, and how it slowly builds over time, and those behaviors, those signs, those symptoms look like normal adolescence, normal childhood, normal teenage angst. There is not necessarily anything that would alert a reasonable and prudent parent to think their child was mentally ill. She said until they have that first break. And when they have that first break, then you're able to see what happens. And heaven knows it is the most tragic thing that the first time this kid does anything really wrong is irredeemable. He can't come back from this. The plaintiff's children can't come back from this. The people who are injured can't come back from this. Tony and Rose will never get their kid back. He can't come back from this. Now, it doesn't really matter. There's been a whole lot of to-do about whether the guns were in the wooden cabinet or the black cabinet because Dimitri said so. And as I told you over and over again, And as Dr. Peterson confirmed, just because Dimitri says it doesn't make it true. Now, plaintiffs want you to believe it when things are easily corroborated, right? Like Dimitri told the police, if you go to my room, I left guns there, I hid them, you can find them. Sure enough, police went, found the guns. But Dimitri also told police, yeah, there's alcohol and cigarettes in my room. FBI searched that room extensively. We've got picture after picture after picture of Dimitri's room, in the drawers, in the closet, on the bed, under the bed, beside the bed. There's no pictures of alcohol or cigarettes. So just because he says it doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean everything he says is wrong, but important things could be wrong. For example, saying the key was on top of the wooden cabinet. You heard Rose say it wasn't. You heard Vossi say when she needed her jewelry, her mom went in the other room and got the key and come unlock the shelf. But even if it was there, even if the keys were left in the lock itself, they didn't break any laws. They didn't do anything wrong because they didn't have a duty to do that. It wouldn't have been unreasonable. But plaintiffs want to build all of these signs of mental illness to say they should have had a heightened duty, that wasn't enough. The fact that he wasn't 17, that's not enough. Because something tragic happened, that's not enough. And I don't disagree with them. Something tragic happened. Everyone in this room wishes it hadn't, but it did. But it's not because Tony and Rose failed to safely store their guns. Rose and Tony safely stored their guns. Their son or anyone else with a criminal intent could have searched the house and found those keys. You saw in some of Dimitri's writings where he was talking about different ways he wanted to try to get a gun, right? Even though he knew the parents' guns were there, and as Mr. McGuire rightfully pointed out multiple times, all he had to do was like break that glass and he could have gotten a gun. He never did that because he knew that would trigger an observation and his parents would jump into action. Just like when he got his own Amazon Prime account. He had his mother's credit card. He had that so he could get fuel to get to school, to get school lunches, whatever he needed to get. And if he ever used it, which Rose told you he did one time, he got a game on Steam for his computer. Rose immediately said, hey, that's not an authorized purchase. He purchased something from Amazon and Rose told you, she said, hey, I didn't tell you you could buy that. Now, that was a ball cap and some t-shirts. It wasn't like something that was malicious, but Rose immediately caught that because she's constantly monitoring her children. So he knew that was going to happen. So he took steps to be furtive so that he wouldn't get caught. It's really ironic because Mr. McGuire has argued, and I don't disagree with him, Dimitri does say in his confession video, I thought they would notice this. But if you look at the context of that, it is absolutely not clear that he's talking about his parents. In fact, it sounds more like he's talking about school officials. Because if he wanted his parents to see something, break that glass. If he wanted his parents to see something, break open that bottom door. If he wanted his parents to see something, use mom's credit card. If he wanted his parents to see something, drive their car drunk. None of these things happened. Instead, what he did was he was sneaky. He was sly. He did not want to get caught so that he could carry out his plan because he knew if he had gotten caught, they would have stopped it. And again, I'm going to draw your attention back to the you don't know what you don't know. And to me, it's amazing how Socrates was able to succinctly identify that problem. After something happens and we see the course of events and the chain of events, it's certainly easier to go, oh, I see that now. But in this case, that's not even clear. Because if you look back at what was actually happening at that time, it certainly wasn't any evidence that there was mental illness going on, even less evidence that their son was going to commit a crime, and absolutely zero evidence that he was going to commit a school shooting, at least from what the parents saw. Now, what the school saw is a completely different thing. They saw a kid wearing a trench coat to school that apparently had these pins of power, or whatever he identified them as, You think the school would pay attention to that. You think the school would pay attention to the searches because they have IT people that do that. This isn't parents at home trying to search their kid's computer, right? I mean, you've got an almost 18-year-old young man who had a computer for right at a period of 5 months. Everything that you saw in court came off that computer, other than some paper journal pages, and it's pretty clear which is which when you look at the pictures. 90% or so, and I didn't do the math for you engineers, I'm just saying, the large proportion of what you saw came off of his computer. And he only had that computer for a period of 5 months. So we know the time period in which this was happening. And it seems from his writings, at least, that he was spiraling in his head during this time period. But he didn't share these writings with his parents. He didn't share them with anyone. And during this 5-month period, there's a lot of stuff going on, right? When you're looking at what's reasonable for these parents to do. During this 5-month period, we've got one mother on hospice. We've got another mother who is very ill. We have a brother who has died. All of this going on within this 5-month period of time. Now, during this 5 months, you did hear Rose say she had actually been on the computer. She didn't see anything, but she didn't search it. Same thing with Vossi. She had been on the computer. She didn't see anything, but she didn't search it. Now, what we do know is, from Dimitri's own words, is that he said a lot of the documents that we're looking at here in court, he had deleted from his computer. So the context that we're missing from the evidence we have is that even if a Rose had searched this computer, would she have even seen this? Because if these are deleted files that the FBI recovered off of the hard drive, Rose wouldn't have seen that. If these are deleted files that the FBI recovered, Vossi wouldn't have seen that, but we're going to hold her responsible because she didn't see it? It doesn't make sense. That's not reasonable. That's not what a reasonable parent would do. A reasonable parent wouldn't remove their kid's hard drive when nothing had happened and go get it analyzed by an IT specialist. That's not reasonable. Now, Mr. McGuire told you in his opening statement that the shooting itself was premeditated, and certainly concede that point to him. All the evidence supports that. He made plans, he made nasty comments about what he wanted to do, he took actions in furtherance of that plan, including buying the ammunition, including stealing the guns from his parents. And as I mentioned earlier, he had talked in several other places about different ways to try to get these guns. It seems that getting the guns from the parents was his last resort, because he talks about trying to maybe get a fake ID so that he can either go to a gun show or go somewhere and buy a gun. But he says in his writings that he didn't have enough money to do that anyway, so he had to abandon that. There's also some information where maybe he asked another kid for a gun. So he had considered other ways to get guns because he knew taking guns would trigger alert with his parents, which is why he took the guns out of the black cabinet in the garage, because it wouldn't be as obvious. As you saw from the pictures in this case, the gun cabinet, even though it's off in the corner of the living room, it's there enough. You see how the guns are stacked. If one is missing, it's going to leave a gap, and that's going to be noticeable. He took them from the other cabinet because he didn't want to be caught. If he wanted to be caught, he would have broken it open. He would have left the cabinet open when he found the keys. He could have done any other number of things, but he didn't because he wanted to hide what he was doing. Now, you have to filter this through the evidence that Dimitri was in the throes of a psychotic break. And again, that's going to be for you to determine if that should mitigate his accountability or not. Dimitri's not my client. I leave those arguments for Mr. Torres. But remember that these efforts that he took to hide the evidence from his parents means they didn't see it, right? And I agree with Mr. McGuire on another thing. I know it's hard to believe we agree on some things. He is right. You don't always know when an Amazon package is going to be delivered, or do you? All you have to do is check the tracking, and it tells you how many stops away your package is. you've got an idea when that package is going to be delivered. And if it's not delivered before you get home, you've got a pretty good idea of when it's going to be delivered, and you can run out there and grab it before anybody sees it. And it's not reasonable to hold the parents responsible for furtive actions of their son that they wouldn't have seen. Now, there's a lot of red flags they talked about. I'm just going to kind of run through some of them. We talked about them in opening. We talked about them throughout the course of the hearing. You know, this financial red flag that he spent $1,700. You heard from the witnesses that he had money that he received for birthdays, holidays. There's extra Greek holidays, other things that he received money for. You heard Katina say that her dad always has cash. It's even possible he stole cash. And Tony even told you from time to time he would give the kids 15, 20, 30 bucks. So as far as him having money, I'm not sure what the financial red flag was there, other than the parents should have known he was spending money that they didn't know he was spending. It's hard for me to figure out. But the reality is that he did have some of his own money, and he did order stuff, and it was delivered to him. There are certainly receipts to show that that happened, including for Lucky Gunner. Now, some of the items that he ordered, they're not all nefarious. You heard Mr. McGuire say something about, don't hold me to it if I get the number wrong. He had 29 packages delivered to his house, which might be true, but some of these are T-shirts. Some of them are sunglasses. Some of them are items that aren't nefarious. Now, certainly bear spray is a really weird thing to order, and tactical gear is clearly something that would be concerning, especially for a kid that hadn't been using guns and to their parents' knowledge didn't like or use guns. That would certainly probably have gotten their attention. But let me point another thing out to you, that in all of those FBI pictures, other than a couple of those items, there are some of those items in the picture. There's some knives and some other items there, but a lot of the other items don't show up in the pictures. So some are there and some are not. Was he keeping him in the car? Was he keeping him at the trailer? We don't know. And the parents wouldn't know that either, because they don't know what they don't know. "30 minutes, Judge? Thank you." Okay. Now, some of the other red flags here, well, let me just say one more on the financial, just to let you know. It's clear that he didn't use the parents' credit cards. It's clear they didn't give him $1,700 to go buy these things. So we know that much. We also know that he went and purchased cash cards in another effort to evade detection, because if he had used those credit cards belonging to his parents, he would have gotten caught. Now, these social red flags is a bit more of an enigma for me, because here we have a kid that over the years has engaged in all kinds of extracurricular activities: soccer, baseball, football, karate, band, Greek dancing, piano lessons, all of these things. I don't see that as a big red flag. In fact, if you look at the picture here, if Ms. Goldsberry will put it up, at the Greek dancing, this was 4 days or 5 days before the shooting occurred. He is out in public, he is dancing, he's involved in this community activity, he's performing. A lot of people have performance anxiety. I mean, that's a thing, even if you're not afraid to be out in crowds, performing, standing up in front of people, doing public speaking or performing causes anxiety. But here he is out there doing this, and he was dancing still in 2 troops. And this was just 4 or 5 days before the shooting occurred. A kid who's out there dancing, you don't see that kid as depressed. And you also heard Dr. Self tell you that if someone is suffering with depression, they are not actively making plans. They're not Googling how to make bombs. They're not out trying to figure out how to hide orders of materials from their parents. They're not actively engaged and involved in any kind of action, much less something that required so many steps in planning as this did, including learning and teaching himself how to modify weapons so that he could do the maximum damage to people, and learning how to make bombs so that he could harm folks. That's not what a depressed person would do. And you heard that from Dr. Self as well. Now, you saw a whole bunch of these computer surveys, and I went through a bunch of these with you earlier, and I'm just going to remind you briefly because, there goes my timer, sorry. Mr. McGuire, in direct testimony, often pulled one or two of these and said, look at this, he's cutting himself. The parents should have seen that. There's really a big mischaracterization of the evidence. 6 times maybe he said he was cutting himself. 33 times he says he's bottling up his emotions in response to the same answer. So you're not getting a full picture. And again, let me remind you, the person answering these surveys, the person making these writings is delusional. Now, one Mr. McGuire pointed out yet again was the massacre. The day before the massacre. We know that mom knew he was depressed because Dimitri said so. And in that writing, Dimitri says, the day before the massacre, my mom said to me, what's wrong with you? Are you depressed? Well, Mr. McGuire said, well, that really wasn't the day before the massacre. It was like 2 days before the massacre. I don't know if he forgot, but I hope that you don't forget that I told you that that same quote in one form or another appears 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times in the context of his 776 pages. The first time it appears on page 116, then it appears again on 172, 352, 355, 346, I got that one out of order, sorry, and 735. So clearly, this is not a truthful recount of something that happened. This reads like a fictional writing, and it goes along with all of his other delusional thoughts. Now, looking at the other social media red flags that the plaintiffs point out, Dimitri did open a Facebook page a couple of weeks, like 2.5, 3 weeks before the shooting occurred. And it seems to me, I don't know how it seems to you, that he was doing that to intentionally memorialize things so that after the event occurred, you could look back and see that. Because we know he was fascinated with school shooters based on his writings. And so he posted a picture of his trench coat, right? And Mr. McGuire said the parents should have seen that and the parents should have been upset about it. Really? Number one, there's no evidence, even though Mr. McGuire says this is a public page, there's no evidence that they didn't have their family, that Dimitri didn't have the family blocked. Furthermore, if the school wasn't startled by him wearing that every day at school, then why would the parents be startled by seeing a picture of it on social media? That seems unlikely to me. And to be clear, even though as a parent myself, if I saw those, it would certainly make me go, what's going on here? He didn't make any threats, overt threats or warnings or forecasts on there. Although one could say that the t-shirt itself, which there is no evidence is a custom t-shirt, by the way. Born to Kill is a phrase that comes from a popular movie, Full Metal Jacket. So we don't know that that was a custom t-shirt unless Mr. McGuire has a separate receipt. And if he does, I apologize. I figure it's an Amazon order. I didn't investigate that closely enough to be 100% on that idea. But there was nothing other than a picture of the shirt that indicated anything else was going on. And there is no evidence that the parents or any family member saw it. And the plaintiffs didn't bring in anybody else to say, this was a public page, the parents were not blocked, there were no IT specialists here. And the same with Dimitri, right? I mean, Mr. Todd, who is very learned and did a very good job cross-examining the experts, he's like, you're free to believe some of what they say, none of what they say, and that's 100% correct. But what they didn't do was bring in an expert who said, that guy is wrong, Dr. Peterson is wrong, Dr. Self is wrong. That didn't happen. Now, Rose did tell you that previously Dimitri had a social media account when he was about 15, and she did monitor it. But he closed it, and to her knowledge, he never had one until he opened it here. You also heard the nosy little sister say, I would go do checks on social media. I would go looking to see if he had a social media account, and I never found any because I wanted to see what Big Brother was up to. So there is no evidence that these were forward-facing public pages as far as the family was concerned. Now, as to the other social red flags, there were some suggestions that the fact that he only had 1 or 2 friends was a big social red flag, but some kids are that way. I've got some kids that are pack animals. When they were young, they ran around with a tribe of children. And I've got some that had only one. In fact, my son, who is my legal assistant that's been here with me, he only had one best friend all the way through high school. They were together all the time. They're just different personalities. There's no idea that that would be a red flag that an individual has a mental illness. Now, there is definitely some merit to the fact that failing grades is a flag. Now, whether it's a red flag or a yellow flag or just a flag, certainly that's something that will require action. And as soon as the grades dropped, we see Rose jumping into action. She jumped up to pull that flag off the flagpole. She tried to figure out what he needed to do to fix it and how to solve that problem. Now, speaking of those emails, you saw Mr. McGuire put that email up saying that it's the email where Rose is talking about she had been gone for a while and she felt so bad and she didn't know what was, going to happen with Dimitri. And they kind of tried to paint that in the context that the email was about mental health. It wasn't. The email was about Rose finding out that her son had plagiarized a paper. And Rose took that so personally. I can't believe my son would do that. That's not who my son is. And she was very upset about that. I mean, in my opinion, overly upset about that. But that had nothing to do with mental health. There's no evidence whatsoever that any individual in any capacity, whether it be at the school, at the church, in the community, anywhere, that anyone told Rose, hey, your son is doing X. This looks problematic. You might want to go get him checked. That never happened. Now, the absences we talked about, that is definitely a failure on behalf of the school. That is very problematic, and I promise you, if Rose had seen that, that would have been a problem. She was on Skyward. She saw the grades. You heard her testify that she did not see those absences there. We now have no way of knowing whether they were on Skyward or not. Plaintiffs would have you believe they were. She doesn't remember seeing them. I guarantee you, if she had seen them, she would have taken action. Now, again, to those physical issues about Dimitri cutting himself, there was zero evidence Dimitri was cutting himself. Mr. McGuire told you that you should know that there's a problem because of the physical signs. And there was some talk about him not showering as often. You heard Rose talk about these, right? These are isolated incidents that are taken out of context. So Rose told you as a teenage boy, his hygiene wasn't what she wanted it to be. He had school football, he was showering at school, but he wasn't always showering at home. And so sometimes she would have to remind him. But she told you when she reminded him, he would go do it. She thought he was being lazy. He wasn't wanting to do his chores. He had some lack of motivation. These are the things that the parents saw. And it's not unreasonable for them to think this is normal teenage behavior or a phase or a mood that would move on. There was no indication of any depression or deep, serious mental illness or any mental illness at all. And these children, both of her children growing up, they were getting regular doctor's visits. They were going to see a doctor who evaluated these kids. And then Dimitri got even extra times at the doctor, other than wellness checks, other than times when he was ill, because he was in sports, multiple sports, and band, which requires additional physicals to be done. And doctors who examined him never saw any symptoms or signs that they thought were problematic and said, hey, Mom, you might want to get this looked at. Because if they had, she would have done something about it. And Dad would have done something too, even though Mom is the primary one who handled the children's education, as you heard from the testimony. Now, in plaintiff's opening statements, they talk about how Dimitri stated he doesn't feel treated like a son. But again, this is a product of Dimitri's delusional state. You've all heard the testimony from Dr. Peterson, where he explained how all of Dimitri's interpersonal relationships, meaning how he related to other people, were tinged and colored by his paranoia and fearfulness. And the most important part, not likely reality. So when you look at things he writes about relationships, for example, I think it's common sense. The things he writes about his schoolmates and feeling ostracized, it's unlikely that schoolmates were treating him that way. Definitely not to the degree he seems to feel it, right? Because that would have drawn attention by a teacher or somebody if that kind of behavior was going on. This was part of Dimitri's delusional state. Now, we talked a little bit about what Mr. McGuire talked about, these intentional signs, and if there was any intent to be intentional, it was at school. And if you re-listen to the clip Mr. McGuire played, you can see, if you agree with me, that it sounds more like he's talking about it in the context of school and not the parents. But there were a million ways for him to make his illness, his suffering, known to his parents, not the least of which are the 3 times that we heard about in the last 5 months before the shooting, where Rose pulled both of her children aside, and even her adult, her 30-plus-year-old stepdaughter, and talked to them about mental illness. When her brother committed suicide, talking to both of them about, if you ever feel this way, talk to me. And whatever happens, don't do anything to take yourself away from me. That's the perfect time to say, Mom, I'm having these awful feelings. After the school shooting in Parkland, she talked to both of her kids and talked about what a tragedy it is, and was, no doubt, and told them, don't ever let your anger or your sadness or your grief or whatever's going on, don't ever let yourself feel that way. If you ever need help, come and tell me. And she would have gotten help for them. But he never said a word. Because of his paranoia, he didn't want to talk about this. He didn't want to talk about Natasha. And Mr. McGuire might be right. Natasha may be a delusion that began from a character in a video game. We used to play is it not Frankenstein? It's Wolfenstein, right? I think, back when my children were younger. And that may indeed be a character. But that doesn't mean that he didn't develop a delusional belief about a character in a video game. A delusion's a delusion, right? It doesn't have a basis in reality. So whether it was just an original manifestation or it was a product of a video game, I think is irrelevant. The fact is that he had the delusion, and you find from his writings that he does talk about extraterrestrials and elder gods and supernatural beings. Albeit he didn't talk about that as much as he did later with Dr. Peterson and others, because once the psychotic break happened and he could no longer hide it, then he could talk about it. After the CIA didn't assassinate him, after the school shooting happened, he could talk about it. And apparently that's what he did with Dr. Peterson. Now, the plaintiffs also said something interesting in their opening argument. They said, we filed this case against Demetrios himself because Demetrios intentionally caused bodily harm to another. And in Texas, when you intentionally cause bodily harm to another, you're responsible for all of the harms and losses that you caused. Now, if that's true, according to their analysis, hold Demetrios 100% responsible for what happened. That is something you can do. And according to plaintiffs' opening arguments, that's a verifiable thing that is a legitimate analysis of what's happened here. I certainly think Lucky Gunner deserves some responsibility as well, but that's for you to decide. Now, the plaintiffs have seemed to want to walk a tightrope in this case. Dimitri wasn't so mentally ill that he shouldn't be held responsible in the civil case. We don't want you to find him insane. He wasn't that sick. He knew what was right from wrong, but we want to argue that he was depressed so that we can make the parents responsible. All of the evidence is to the contrary. Dimitri has not stood trial because he's mentally incompetent. Dimitri has been evaluated by Dr. Peterson and been found to be mentally incompetent. Dimitri is living in a delusional state right now. That's where he is. That's the evidence. The evidence isn't that he had some minor or major depressive disorder. That's not what he had. That's not what he has. But it makes it easier, right? Because they know they're not going to get a recovery from Dimitri because he's going to be either in a mental institution or a prison the rest of his life. That's a given. The parents are the only, and Lucky Gunner are the only other two options here to get a recovery. If this is really about justice and not about money, then you can write zeros in the amount for all of those, and you can hold whoever you want 100% responsible. But it's not just about that. If it's just about justice, we would wait for the criminal trial, and the criminal would be tried, and then we would see what the justice was. That's what justice is. This is trying to hold the parents responsible for a horrific event that affected them as well and made victims out of them also. Now, this is my last opportunity. Oh, Judge, mine shows an hour and 3 minutes. I have an hour and 20 minutes, right?
You do.
Okay, I show 1:03, so I should still have about 17 minutes? Okay. I just want to make sure before I get too far afield here. Okay, so I lost my train of thought there with the time warning, so I apologize. The reality is that Dimitri committed this crime. He took these guns. And we know that insanity and intelligence are not mutually exclusive. It is possible to be both at the same time. And I know the plaintiffs don't want to believe that there weren't red flags. And I'm going to share with you a little bit why I feel so much for these defendants. First of all, I want to tell you that this is the last moment that I have to talk with you.
Well, any personal comments are
No,
improper or...
no, they're not.
This is closing argument. What the attorneys say is not evidence, and you'll be determined in this case based upon the evidence and testimony that's been entered during this case.
Thank you, Judge. And you'll see the reason why that just happened. First of all, it's the last chance I'm going to have to talk to you. And they're going to get up and remember things that I forgot to say. They're going to go back and find something that I don't have an opportunity to respond to. So I'm going to ask you to remember, try to think what I would say if I had an opportunity to address that. Because most of the big issues we addressed in trial. But the reason I wanted to share with you a personal experience and why I have so much compassion for Rose and Tony is because it could be me. That could be me sitting right there. My son died 5 months ago. He had schizophrenia. He was more of an introvert than an extrovert. He liked to play video games.
We're going to have to object to this.
Your Honor, you can share personal stories in closing.
Not that.
I can share the case if you'd like to know it.
Approach, please.
Many of us have had personal experiences similar to what the defendants have gone through. And while nobody's asking you to take any sympathy or empathy or prayers or grief or love away from the plaintiffs and those who are injured, I'm just asking you to find a little bit of room to understand that something happened to them as well. Something that they couldn't control, something that they didn't know about, a force of nature bearing down upon them. And they'll never be the same again either. They didn't do anything intentional. They didn't do anything negligent. They had no duty to do more than what they did. In fact, it's the opposite. They did more than their duty required of them. And they did it willingly to try to safely store their guns. There's nothing that keeps any criminal, whether it be your own son, your own daughter, or any other person, from committing a criminal act. We had the one witness who was talking about his almost impenetrable gun safe. It weighs 300 pounds. Okay, so you get two men to go pick it up and carry it out of your house. I mean, there's always a way around security if you're intent on committing a crime. And that's what this young man did. And again, mental health part of that is for you to consider, and Mr. Torres will talk to you about that. But Rose and Tony should not be held responsible for the young adult that did this, whether it was his mental illness or not. There's no evidence they knew he was mentally ill and they ignored it. They would not have done that. They're a very loving and close family, even if there's some temper and normal things that most of us have in their household. Even if they got into a fight one time and Rose says, "I'm going to divorce you." My husband's over there. I've said that to him I don't know how many times this week. That's what happens when people get mad. You say things that you don't mean. It doesn't mean that you don't love your spouse. It doesn't mean you don't love your family. It means that you had an argument and you lost your temper. That happens. You heard from Dr. Peterson that there was no reports of any kind of violence in this household, physical violence. Now the temper of Tony is kind of up in the air, whether you believe he's volatile or not, and may have thrown a few things a few times. You'll decide what you believe from what the witnesses said. But what's very clear is the report, even from Dimitri himself, says there was never any physical violence. So there weren't any actions in the home that was taken by these parents that caused what happened. There's not any actions that they should have been aware of that they could have done. Now, in hindsight, we all know is easy. We can all say, they should have taken those guns and buried them in a landfill somewhere. They should have, taken them and had them melted down for spare parts. And surely if something like this was foreseeable, they would have done that. We can't foresee every bad thing that happens in life. Some things happen through no fault of our own. This is certainly through no fault of the plaintiffs. They didn't ask for this. They didn't deserve this. But for whatever reasons, Dimitri picked up a gun and he took action. Rose and Tony didn't pick up a gun. They didn't do this. They didn't give consent. They didn't give permission. They didn't give him the keys. They didn't give him the guns. And the guns weren't readily dischargeable. He had to go and buy ammunition for them, which is what Lucky Gunner gave him, when he shouldn't have. So I'm asking that you find Rose and Tony legally responsible for what happened. Now, emotionally, they feel terrible, and they're going to be scarred for the rest of their life because this is what their son did, and they wish they had seen it. They really do. But they can't go back and change that. None of us can. But look at what they knew and when they knew it, and were their actions reasonable? And I think common sense tells you it is. You remember during the trial, I made a comment about there was no statute that required them to act differently. And Mr. McGuire jumped up and said, "What about the law of common sense?" Okay, well, the law of common sense is great, but they did more than common sense would say. They locked them up. Common sense would say you just put them out of reach. They locked them up. The fact that their son searched the house to find the keys to steal the guns is not foreseeable. So That is our request, that you put 0 on both of theirs. Divide the responsibility equally between Dimitri and Lucky Gunner if you want. If you think Dimitri's mental illness mitigates it, put 100% on Lucky Gunner, because if he didn't have those bullets, the shooting wouldn't have happened. There's no evidence that any of the bullets came from the parents' house. I thank you again for your time and your attention. I know it's been a long 3 weeks. I appreciate you more than you know. My clients appreciate you more than you know. And I know you've got a hard job ahead of you. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Closing arguments at that time.
All rise for the jury.
All right, this court will stand at recess till 3:15.
where our congressmen and representatives make it, whether it's state or federal. And then there's what's called common law. And as I mentioned, common law is supposed to make common sense. And it actually starts with a jury and a judge that submits a certain set of facts. You think this should be a duty? There's already an existent common law as to what these parents should have done.
Your Honor, I object. That's not accurate, and the law is what's in the jury charge, so.
May I continue?
The law is as instructed by you, and you're to follow that law as set forth in the charge of the court.
And if there was no law for you to consider, you wouldn't be here. And this court wouldn't be instructing you to answer these questions. The common law starts with people like you. But I always ask myself in situations like this, who was in the best position to see that this didn't happen? Who should know Dimitri the best? And this is something that didn't happen just overnight. It was over 3 to 4 years. If you know your child, you're going to know when they're happy and you're going to know when they're sad. According to them, they didn't know any of that. They didn't see anything wrong. Well, if you don't look, you're not going to see. And as far as Santa Fe, and there's not a question in there about Santa Fe. You remember Special Agent Smith? His name hasn't been mentioned too much in these closing arguments. What did he say? The only thing the FBI took from the Santa Fe High School was a computer that showed the surveillance tape. No other data was taken. What does that leave? That leaves the computers in their home. When it,
That's a mischaracterization of the evidence. There are several law enforcement agencies involved in this investigation.
none of which testified, Your Honor.
And again, you are to make a decision in this case based upon the evidence as submitted to.
When it comes to storing weapons, there's not a margin of error. The risk is too great. The instrumentality can kill. There is no margin of error. This young man was in their home, their child, their responsibility, their guns. In an odd way, it's good that Dimitri did not kill himself. Dr. Peterson was hired in connection with a criminal matter to avoid accountability. Through Dr. Peterson, when they were talking to him in these interviews, they were thinking about accountability in the criminal trial. They weren't thinking about accountability in a civil trial. Yet in the civil trial, they wanted to back away from what they said and say, out of context. Well, when Stephen Bland, Dr. Peterson said, Stephen Bland reported that he saw depression in the 9th and 10th grade. What could a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old see?
Your Honor, I object to mischaracterization of the evidence.
It would be your job to determine the facts in the case, and you are to apply those facts in reaching your decision in this case.
You remember what I asked Dr. Peterson about Stephen Bland. Also, they told Dr. Peterson they knew there was a problem, they just didn't know how to fix it. And they want to back away from that as well. We have an epidemic in this country when it comes to gun violence in schools. You know, I thought on December 14 of 2012, when 26 people were killed at Sandy Hook, 20 of which were 6 and 7-year-olds. I thought to myself, what does it take? But that wasn't enough. Look at the carnage that's occurred in our schools since that date. Our legislators are doing nothing. But you, the people, can make your statement known. what you think. And it'll be heard. You know, Santa Fe High School in Friendswood, where I raised my 7 children, he's number 6. Our communities are a lot alike. We competed in football, we competed in all sorts of sports. And the biggest social event in Santa Fe, kind of like Friendswood, it's not some black tie affair. It's opening day of baseball and softball season. It's the homecoming parade. If they had a bumper sticker, it would say, family first. Because family is important in Santa Fe, Texas. You know, something that has bothered me since I saw it was a documentary that was done concerning this massacre, entitled Kids of Santa Fe, the largest unknown mass shooting. By your verdict, you can change that name, Kids of Santa Fe, the mass shooting that made a difference. To the parents and the victims, you waited a long time for this day. A long time. And you remember when I had Rhonda on the stand, I said, Rhonda, I represent you and I represent Kimberly. Remember that? I didn't know Kimberly. But if Kimberly had something to say to you, and she would, I think what she would say, you were all good parents. You weren't just good parents, you were great parents. You raised great kids. None of us deserve to die. We had our whole lives in front of us. And those lives were taken away. And you know, the last thing that I think Kimberly would want me to say to you is this right here. In a moment, the weight of this case will pass from me to you. I've been doing this a while. I've never been more proud to be a lawyer than I have in this last 3 weeks. I am blessed to be here. I'm the oldest guy in this courtroom. And to be here and stand before you is an immeasurable honor. And the idea of being made a part of change, an idea that might start something good, you can't measure that in money. But is it valuable? You bet it is. When you get back in the jury room, and if one and each of you and several of you feel as we feel, you can advocate back there in that room for us. We are counting on you to advocate for us, and you can feel good about it. And by your verdict, you can provide a measure of accountability and justice that this family has not received by our district attorney, and I'm not blaming him. His hands are tied by the law. You can provide a measure of respect for these families, these children, in our country, and what we need. You know, Mr. Torres was talking about the world. We are the example for the world. A lot of the world doesn't get it about our gun culture. They don't get it. But they really don't get it if we allow carnage in our schools. What is wrong with us? And we set the example. You now make the decision as to what that example would be. It's been a pleasure to appear before you, and we look forward to receiving your verdict.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've now heard all of the evidence and testimony in this case, and you've had the opportunity to receive the charge and instructions of the court, and the opportunity to hear closing arguments of the. So it will be now time for you to retire to the jury room to begin to deliberate. Now, once you retire to the jury room, you will select your presiding juror. The first thing the presiding juror will need to do is to have this complete charge read aloud, and then you will deliberate upon your answers to the questions asked. It is the duty of the presiding juror to preside during your deliberations, to see that your deliberations are conducted in an orderly manner and in accordance with the instructions in this charge. To write out and to hand to the bailiff any communications concerning the case that you desire to have delivered to the judge. To vote on the questions, to write your answers to the questions in the spaces provided, and to certify your verdict in the space provided for the presiding juror's signature, or to obtain those signatures of all of those jurors who agree with the verdict if your verdict should be less than unanimous. You should not discuss this case with anyone, not even with other members of the jury, unless all of you are present and assembled in the jury room. Should anyone attempt to talk to you about this case before the verdict is returned, whether at the courthouse, at your home, or elsewhere, you should immediately inform the court of this fact. When you have answered all the questions you are required to answer under the instructions of the judge, and your presiding juror has placed those answers in the spaces provided and signed the verdict as presiding juror, or obtain the signatures, you will inform the bailiff at the door of the jury room that you have reached a verdict, and then you will return into court with your verdict. Now, that verdict form is attached to the charge of the court for you, your presiding juror, to fill out and to sign once a verdict has been reached. Now, there is a change in the instructions. Earlier I advised you that you would not be allowed to take your notes to the jury room, but all counsel as well as the court have agreed that many of you took notes during the last 3 weeks, and due to the length and the complexity of this trial and the amount of evidence that has been admitted during these 3 weeks, you are going to be allowed to take your notes into the jury room with this understanding and with this instruction. Any notes you have taken are for your own personal use. You may take your notes back into the jury room and consult them during deliberations, but you are not to show or read those notes to your fellow jurors during the deliberations. Your notes are not evidence. Each of you should rely on your own independent recollection of the evidence and not be influenced by the fact that another juror has or has not taken notes. You must leave your notes with the bailiff when you are not deliberating, and he will make sure that the notes are kept in a safe and secure location and not disclosed to anyone. After the deliberations have been completed, the bailiff will collect those notes. And once you are released from jury duty, the bailiff will promptly destroy those notes so that nobody can read what you have written. So that is your instruction with respect to those notes you have taken during the course of the trial. If there are any communications that need to be made with the court, there is a form that the bailiff will show you that is being provided to you that is called a jury communication form. And it will need, if there's any communication to be done with the court, it needs to be in writing on that jury form and signed by your jury foreperson. And then the bailiff will immediately deliver that question or note to me. So at this time, again, once you have all assembled in the jury room, you may begin your deliberations. And that instruction I told you earlier about you couldn't discuss the case will not apply once you are all assembled and in the jury room and begin your deliberations. And this court will stand in recess until such time as you, the jury, have reached a verdict in this case. All right, at this time, you may proceed to the jury room to begin your deliberation.